The brass key turned in the lock of the private reading room with a final, decisive click, sealing Isolde Vera inside with the man whose name now legally belonged to her fate. Candlelight carved sharp angles across his face. High cheekbones, storm-gray eyes narrowed to slits of controlled fury, as he slowly unfolded the marriage contract she had just signed in innocent haste. "You thought this was your sister's betrothal," he said, voice low and lethal, each syllable a blade. "It is not. It is mine. And you, Miss Vera, have just become the Duchess of Irreversible." Isolde felt the world lurch beneath her sensible half-boots, the weight of ink and wax suddenly heavier than iron chains. He stepped forward, tall, dark, unyielding, the very air seeming to bow around him. "There will be no annulment," he continued, softer now, almost tender, yet infinitely more dangerous for it. "You signed. I accept. Welcome to your new life, wife. If this locked-door moment of irreversible fate has your heart racing and your breath caught, subscribe now, because the battle for trust, truth, and love has only just begun." The brass bell above the outer door gave a single, tired chime as Isolde Vera stepped into the narrow vestibule of Hartwell and Chadwick solicitors. January rain had followed her across the threshold. It dripped from the hem of her charcoal cloak and pooled on the black and white tiles in small, accusing mirrors. She shook the droplets from her gloves with the brisk economy of someone accustomed to making do, then lifted her eyes to the clerk's high desk. The young man behind it knew, she thought, since last Michaelmas, barely glanced up from his ledger. "Name and appointment, if you please." "Isolde Vera, for the signing of Miss Cordelia Vera's betrothal contract with Viscount Langley." He scratched a note without looking at her face. "Mrs. Vera and Miss Cordelia are already with Mr. Hartwell. You may wait here or—" "I'll wait inside," Isolde said quietly, already moving past him. He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. Something in the calm, unhurried way she carried herself discouraged argument. The inner corridor smelled of old beeswax, ink, and the faint metallic bite of wet umbrellas. Gas lamps hissed behind frosted globes. Their light turned the turkey runner underfoot the color of dried blood. Isolde's half-boots made no sound. She had learned, long ago, how to walk so that no one noticed the sound of her coming or going. At the end of the passage a door stood ajar. Inside, her mother's voice rose and fell in the bright, anxious cadences of someone trying to convince herself that everything was proceeding perfectly. "And the settlement is quite generous, Mr. Hartwell. Viscount Langley has been most particular." Isolde paused just outside the threshold. Cordelia sat in the best chair, back straight, rose-pink gown arranged around her like petals, cheeks flushed with the excitement of a bride-to-be who had never once doubted her destiny. Their mother fluttered beside her, small gloved hands smoothing already perfect skirts. Mr. Hartwell, round-faced and perspiring, was attempting to locate the correct document among several stacks on his desk. Isolde felt the familiar, quiet pang, half affection, half resignation. She had dressed for invisibility today. Charcoal wool, high-necked bodice, hair braided and pinned so tightly it pulled at her temples. No lace, no ribbons, no color that might draw the eye. Practical, useful, exactly as expected. She stepped inside. No one looked up. Mr. Hartwell muttered something about the press of business today and 3 major matters at once. He disappeared through a connecting door into what appeared to be a larger chamber, leaving the 3 women in a silence broken only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Cordelia opened her reticule and took out her little silver mirror. She tilted her head, studied the arrangement of her dark curls, then smiled at her own reflection with serene satisfaction. "Do you think Langley will like the new lace on my pelisse?" she asked the mirror. "He'll be enchanted," Mrs. Vera answered before Isolde could speak. "Everything about you enchants him, darling." Isolde moved to the side table and began straightening the scattered papers there, Old habit, small order in chaos. The connecting door opened again. A different clerk, this one older, harried, spectacles askew, thrust a thick sheaf of foolscap into her hands without preamble. Contract for signature, miss. Mr. Hartwell says to witness where indicated. He'll be along directly. He was already turning away. 3 estates in today, he added over his shoulder. The Duke's business has thrown the entire office into disarray. Isolde looked down at the document. Heavy rag paper, copperplate script, the weight of legal intent in every line. At the top, in flowing black ink, contract of marriage. Her stomach gave a small, uneasy lurch. But the clerk had said witness, and she had witnessed dozens of documents in this office over the years. Leases, settlements, codicils. Cordelia's betrothal was the culmination of 3 seasons of careful strategy. Isolde had helped draft the heads of agreement herself. This was merely the final, formal step. She carried the papers to Mr. Hartwell's desk, sat in the solicitor's vacated chair, and opened the sheaf. The groom's signature was already there, bold, slashing, unmistakable. Cashin Vale, Duke of Arinder. Below it, 2 witness lines. Below those, the bride's signature line blank. Isolde exhaled. A clerical oversight, nothing more. The clerk had simply handed her the wrong stack. She would sign as witness, Mr. Hartwell would arrive. They would locate Cordelia's actual contract, and the day would proceed as planned. She dipped the quill, signed her name in the first witness space with the quick, clear strokes that had balanced household books and placated creditors for years. Isolde Vera. The ink gleamed wetly, black as prophecy. She had barely set the quill down when the connecting door burst open. He filled the frame, tall, broad-shouldered, dark coat cut to emphasize both power and restraint. Rain glistened on the shoulders of that coat. He must have come straight from the street. His hair, black as the ink on the page, was damp and slightly disordered. But it was his eyes that stopped the breath in her throat. Storm gray, winter cold, and currently blazing with something very close to murder. What? He said, each syllable carved from ice. Are you doing with that document? Isolde looked down at the contract, then up at the stranger whose name was already bound to hers on the page. She felt the room tilt very slightly, the way a ship tilts before the first real wave. I was witnessing my sister's betrothal, she said. Her voice came out steady, remarkably steady, considering. The man crossed the carpet in 3 strides. He snatched the papers from the desk. His gaze raked the page, once, twice. Color leached from the high bones of his cheeks, then rushed back in a dark, dangerous flush. This, he said, voice dangerously soft, is not your sister's betrothal contract. He thrust the document toward her. This is my marriage contract, with a special license already attached. And you, his finger stabbed toward her still damp signature, have just signed it, as the bride. The world made a slow, sickening revolution. Isolde seized the papers. Her eyes flew down the text she had skimmed so carelessly before. There, plain as day now that she knew what to look for, between Cashin Vale, Duke of Arinder, and blank space, the undersigned bride. Her name stared back at her in her own careful hand. Oh, she whispered, then louder because Dania seemed suddenly childish. Oh God! The Duke of Arinder regarded her with the expression of a man who has just been handed a loaded pistol when he expected a handkerchief. You have precisely 1 chance, he said, to explain how you came to sign a marriage contract with me. Isolde rose. She was not tall. Her eyes reached only to his cravat, but she lifted her chin until their gazes locked. The clerk thrust this into my hands and told me to witness where indicated, she said. I believed it was my sister's contract. I was wrong. For 1 heartbeat, 2, he simply stared at her. Then the corner of his mouth twitched, once, almost imperceptibly. Not amusement, something colder. Wrong, he repeated, tasting the word. He turned the single syllable into a verdict. Behind him, Mrs. Vera made a small sound of distress. Cordelia's mirror slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. The Duke ignored both women. His attention remained fixed on Isolde, as though she were the only other living creature in the room. "This contract," he said, "bears my signature, completed before witnesses not 20 minutes ago. It bears a special license, obtained at considerable expense and influence. It is, under English law, binding." Isolde's mouth went dry. "Surely it can be voided. It was a mistake. A clerical error." "Clerical errors," he said softly, "do not create duchesses." He stepped closer. The scent of rain and cedar and something sharper, anger, perhaps, or anticipation, enveloped her. "I was to marry Lady Seraphina Langford," he continued, each word measured, deliberate. "The contract was prepared, the license secured, the announcement drafted. And now," he lifted one dark brow, "thanks to your efficiency, Miss Vera, I appear to have acquired a different wife." Isolde felt the floor shift beneath her sensible boots. She had spent 24 years being practical, being useful, being the sister who fixed things. Now she had fixed something that could not be unfixed. And the man she had fixed it to was looking at her, as though she were the most interesting puzzle he had ever been handed. "Tell me, Miss Vera," he said, voice dropping to something almost gentle, "do you faint under pressure?" She swallowed. "No, Your Grace." A ghost of a smile, sharp, fleeting, dangerous. "Good," he said, "because there will be no annulment. There will be no quiet dissolution. You signed. I accept." He leaned down until his mouth was near her ear, his breath warm against the chilled shell of it. "Welcome to your new life, Duchess. What would you do if the ink of a single mistaken signature rewrote your entire future? Comment below, and stay with us, because the storm that follows this moment will change everything." The rain had thickened into a steady, wind-driven downpour by the time the Vera carriage rattled away from Hartwell and Chadwick. Inside, the silence was louder than the weather. Mrs. Vera sat ramrod straight, gloved hands knotted in her lap, lips moving in silent rehearsal of phrases she would never have occasion to speak again. Cordelia stared out the window, watching rain streak the glass in long silver tears, her perfect composure cracked only by the faint tremor of her lower lip. Isolde occupied the forward-facing seat, back to the horses, hands folded neatly in the lap of her charcoal gown. No one had spoken since the Duke had issued his final, quiet order to the clerk. "Inform my solicitor that the contract is executed. The license will be registered this afternoon. The Duchess and I will depart immediately." The Duchess. The word still felt foreign, like a garment cut for someone else. Isolde watched the familiar streets of Mayfair slide past. Porticoed houses, wrought iron railings, gas lamps flickering bravely against the gray afternoon, and tried to catalogue what she knew about the man who had just claimed her as wife. Cashin Vale, 8th Duke of Arinder, 31 years old, inherited at 19 after his elder brother's sudden death from fever. Known in Parliament for ruthless efficiency on trade bills and shipping charters. Known in society for cold courtesy, impeccable tailoring, and a string of broken betrothals that had become something of a grim joke among the matchmaking mamas. Most recently, until approximately 47 minutes ago, betrothed to Lady Seraphina Langford, only daughter of the Earl of Hartington. The match had been announced in October, the wedding set for Easter, and now there was Isolde. She felt her mother's gaze settle on her like damp wool. "Arabella?" Mrs. Vera began, voice thin. "I cannot fathom how this has happened." "Isolde," she corrected gently. "My name is Isolde." Her mother blinked, as though the correction were a new piece of information. "Yes, of course. Isolde." A pause. "But how?" "I signed the wrong document." The words came out flat, factual. "The clerk thrust it into my hands and told me to witness. I did." The Duke's name was already there, the license attached, the ink still wet. Cordelia turned from the window. Her cornflower eyes were wide, shimmering. "But you're going to be a duchess." The statement hung between them, fragile and absurd. "Yes," Isolde said. "Apparently I am." Mrs. Vera pressed gloved fingers to her lips. "A duchess, my daughter, a duchess." The repetition seemed to steady her. "We must think of the advantages, the consequence, the—" She faltered, then rallied. "The settlement will be magnificent, surely. You'll want for nothing." Isolde felt a bubble of something dangerously close to laughter rise in her throat. She swallowed it down. "I imagine the Duke of Arinder can afford to keep a wife in reasonable comfort," she said dryly. Cordelia's lower lip trembled again. "But you didn't want to marry," she whispered. "You always said you were content, that you would stay with Mama and manage the house and be useful." The word landed like a dropped pin in the swaying carriage. Useful. Isolde had used it herself countless times, had worn it like armor. Useful daughters didn't expect courtship. Useful daughters didn't hope for love matches. Useful daughters kept account books, placated creditors, mended linens, and made certain their prettier, more marriageable sisters were presented to best advantage. She had never minded, or so she told herself. Now, sitting across from her mother and sister with the weight of a ducal title newly settled on her shoulders, she discovered that content had been a polite fiction. Beneath it lay something rawer, a quiet, stubborn certainty that she would never be chosen, not for herself, not for desire, only for utility. And yet a man who could have had any woman in England, any woman, had looked at her across a solicitor's cluttered desk, had seen her plain brown gown and ink-stained fingers and unflinching gaze, and decided to keep her. She didn't understand it. She wasn't certain she ever would. The carriage turned into the familiar narrow street where the Vera house stood. 3 stories of faded brick, window boxes empty in January, railings in need of fresh blacking. It had always seemed respectable enough. Now it looked small, temporary. As the steps were let down, Mrs. Vera reached across the narrow space and caught Isolde's hand. Her fingers were cold. "You must write," she said urgently. "Every week. Tell us everything. And if there is anything you require, anything at all, I will write," Isolde promised. She squeezed her mother's hand once, firmly, then released it. "And I will be well." Cordelia was crying now, small, elegant tears that left no mark on her rose-pink cheeks. "You'll visit?" she asked. "When you're a duchess, you'll still visit us?" Isolde leaned forward and kissed her sister's damp cheek. "I will visit," she said, "and you will visit me. Blackmore House is large enough for many guests." Cordelia gave a watery laugh. "I shall bring Langley. He will be excessively impressed." "I'm sure he will." The footman was waiting, umbrella raised. Isolde stepped down into the rain. She turned back once, saw her mother and sister framed in the carriage doorway. 2 golden heads, 2 pairs of wide, uncertain eyes, and felt a pang so sharp it stole her breath. Then the door closed. The Dukestown carriage waited at the curb, black lacquer gleaming wetly, the Arinder crest picked out in discreet silver. The coachman touched his hat. The footman opened the door. Isolde hesitated. Behind her, the front door of the house she had managed for 7 years stood open. Lamplight spilled onto the wet pavement. Inside were the familiar smells of lemon oil and damp wool and her mother's lavender water. Inside was the life she knew. Ahead lay something else entirely. She drew a breath, squared her shoulders, and climbed into the carriage. The door closed behind her with a soft, expensive thud. Inside, the Duke waited. He had discarded his wet greatcoat. His dark coat and snowy cravat were immaculate, as though the rain had not dared touch him. He occupied the forward seat, long legs stretched before him, hands resting loosely on his thighs. When she settled opposite, he regarded her with that same unreadable intensity. "You are quiet," he observed. "I am thinking." "About what?" "About how quickly a life can change," she said, "and about how little I know of the life I am entering." He inclined his head. "Fair enough. Ask." She considered. "Why refuse annulment?" A beat of silence. "Because," he said at last, "I find myself curious." "Curious?" "You stood your ground," he said simply. "Most women, most people would have dissolved into hysterics. You looked me in the eye, admitted the mistake, and then demanded to know how to rectify it. That is unusual." Isolde felt heat climb her throat. "I was trying not to faint." His mouth curved very slightly. "You succeeded admirably." Another silence, softer this time. Then quietly, "There is another reason." She waited. "I was to marry Lady Seraphina because the match was advantageous. Her father controls key votes on the shipping charters I require for my Atlantic ventures. The marriage was a transaction, civil, bloodless, mutually beneficial. I expected nothing more. I wanted nothing more." He paused. "Until 20 minutes ago, when a woman in a charcoal gown looked at me as though I were a problem to be solved rather than a prize to be won." Isolde's breath caught. "I do not wish for a transaction," he said. "I find I would prefer a mystery." The carriage rattled over a loose cobble. "You may come to regret that preference, Your Grace." "Sebastian," he corrected. She blinked. "My name is Sebastian," he repeated softer. "And if we are to be married, I would have you use it." "Sebastian," she tested. The syllables felt strange, intimate, dangerous. He watched her mouth form his name. Something flickered in his storm-gray eyes, something that looked almost like hunger. "Tell me," he said, "what you fear most about this marriage." She considered lying, then discarded the impulse. "That I will be invisible again," she said. "That I will spend the rest of my life managing your household, balancing your books, raising your heirs, while you continue to look through me the way everyone else always has." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, until their faces were close enough that she could see the faint silver threads at his temples, the small scar at the corner of his left eyebrow. "You will not be invisible," he said, and the words were a vow. "Not to me." She wanted desperately to believe him. The carriage slowed. Blackmore House rose before them. Pale stone, towering windows, iron railings gleaming wetly in the rain. It looked like a fortress. It looked like a cage. Sebastian extended his hand. Isolde hesitated for one heartbeat longer. Then she placed her fingers in his. His grip was warm, firm, steady. He helped her down into the rain, opened his greatcoat, and drew her beneath it as they climbed the steps together. The door opened. Warmth and light spilled out. She stepped over the threshold into her new life. And somewhere deep inside, so quietly she almost missed it, a small, stubborn part of her began to hope. What would you risk if someone promised to see you, truly see you, for the first time? Comment below. The next chapter. Waits. The document was supposed to be routine, another stack of papers in a sea of ink and seals. Isolde barely glanced at the heading before signing, trusting the clerk's hurried assurance that it was a standard registry form. The quill had moved across the page almost of its own accord, the familiar scratch of nib on vellum, a sound she had known since childhood. Routine. Safe. Forgettable. It was only when the heavy chamber doors groaned open on their iron hinges that the world tilted. The Duke of Ravenshollow entered alone. No herald announced him. No retinue of armored men or silk-clad attendants trailed behind. Just the man himself, tall, broad-shouldered, cloaked in charcoal wool edged with raven feathers that caught the torchlight like spilled oil. His boots struck the stone floor with the deliberate cadence of someone who had never needed to hurry. The air changed in his wake, grew heavier, colder, as though winter had stepped indoors. Silence fell so completely that Isolde heard her own heartbeat in her ears. His gaze moved first to the parchment still lying open on the table, the fresh ink of her signature gleaming beneath the ducal seal pressed in crimson wax. Then it lifted, slowly, inevitably, to her face. The truth landed like a thunderclap in an empty hall. She had not signed a registry form. She had signed a marriage contract. The clerk beside her made a small, strangled sound. Others began to babble. Overlapping apologies, frantic explanations of clerical error, misplaced pages, the press of urgent business. But the Duke raised one gloved hand. The gesture was small. It was enough. The room stilled. He did not shout. He did not need to. His voice, when it came, was low and measured, carrying the same quiet finality as the closing of a crypt door. There will be no annulment. The senior official, a man who had served 3 dukes before this one, actually took a step forward, mouth opening to protest. The Duke's eyes flicked to him. The man stopped as though physically restrained. A ducal marriage, once sealed and witnessed, Lucian continued, cannot be undone without consequence. Not in law, not in custom, not while Raven's Hollow stands. The words were calm. They were principle. They were also a sentence. Isolde felt the shock strike her like cold water thrown across the face. Sharp, stealing breath, prickling every nerve. Her fingers, still curled around the quill she had not yet released, trembled once, violently, before she forced them still. Most women would have cried out, collapsed, begged for mercy. She did none of those things. The initial paralysis burned away in seconds, leaving something hotter, harder, brighter in its place. Fury, yes, but not the wild, flailing kind. This was fury distilled, cold, precise, and utterly her own. If fate or clerical incompetence had dragged her into this iron trap, she would not spend her strength rattling the bars in panic. She would not beg. She would not diminish herself before this man or any other. She straightened slowly, shoulders back, chin lifted until the line of her throat was exposed, not in vulnerability, but in defiance. She met his gaze directly, storm-gray eyes against hers of winter-sea blue. Neither blinked. The chamber seemed to shrink around them, the rest of the world falling away until there were only 2 people left standing. The Duke who would not bend, and the woman who refused to break. I will not be small, she said. Her voice did not waver. It did not plead. It simply stated a fact, as unarguable as the stone beneath their feet. The Duke regarded her for a long moment, long enough that the silence grew roots. Something moved behind his expression, too subtle to name. Curiosity, calculation, the first faint spark of interest in something that was not a battlefield or a border map. When he finally spoke again, his tone was unchanged. Still low, still calm, but there was a new weight to it. Then be large, Lady Isolde, he said. Be very large indeed, for you will need every inch of that resolve before this is done. He turned then, cloak sweeping behind him like a shadow detaching from its source, and walked toward the far doors without another word. The officials parted before him like water before a ship's prow. Isolde remained exactly where she stood, spine straight, hands no longer shaking. Shock had come. Shock had passed. What remained was something sharper, something she could hold in her palm like a blade she had only just begun to learn how to wield. Defiant determination. The marriage was sealed. So was her decision. She would endure this. She would survive it. And when the time was right, she would reshape it. The heavy doors closed behind the Duke with a dull, echoing thud. In the sudden quiet that followed, Isolde drew one long, steady breath. The first breath of the rest of her life. The ducal estate of Raven's Hollow sprawled across the northern moors like a great dark beast crouched against the wind. Its towers rose black against winter skies. Its halls gleamed with cold marble veined in silver, and every corridor seemed to echo with the memory of older, sterner days. Tradition here was not ornament. It was architecture. It held the place together when everything else threatened to fly apart. Isolde arrived in 3 plain brown dresses, 1 trunk, and no lady's maid. The steward had nearly fainted when she declined the offer of 3 additional gowns, 6 attendants, and a ceremonial welcome banquet. "It is custom, my lady," he had stammered. "Custom," she replied, calm as a still pond, "is not the same as necessity." She moved into the east wing, the oldest, draftiest, least fashionable part of the keep, because it had windows that looked out over the working stables and the kitchen gardens instead of the formal parterres. She liked seeing things that moved, things that lived. Servants whispered behind their hands as she passed. "She dresses like a merchant's daughter. She speaks to the scullery maids by name. She counted the silver herself, counted it." Nobles who came to pay their respects frowned behind fans and lace cuffs. A duchess was meant to ornament, to reflect the duke's glory, not to rearrange the stillroom shelves or question why the laundry was being done 3 times a week when twice would suffice. Isolde noticed everything. She noticed the head cook's hands shaking from 16-hour days and too little sleep. She noticed the footmen who limped because ill-fitting boots had worn through their soles months ago. She noticed the endless parade of ceremonial meals that left half the food untouched while the lower kitchens scraped by on yesterday's bread. She did not announce reforms with proclamations. She simply began. First, the kitchens. She arrived one morning before dawn with sleeves rolled to her elbows and asked the cook, quietly, respectfully, what she needed most. By the next week there were 2 new apprentices, a revised roster so no one worked past midnight, and a ledger that tracked actual consumption instead of tradition. Waste dropped. Tempers eased. Bread tasted better. Then the household schedules. She sat with the steward for 3 long evenings, listening more than speaking, until the man, grudgingly, admitted that half the rituals served no purpose beyond reminding everyone who had once held power. Some were quietly retired. Others streamlined. The house exhaled. Servants began to meet her eyes instead of dropping them. A few even smiled. Sebastian Lucien watched it all from a distance. He had expected sullen compliance at best, open rebellion at worst. He had braced for tears, slammed doors, demands for gowns and jewels and the life she believed she had been denied. Instead she was useful, efficient, quietly, infuriatingly competent. It irritated him. He told himself it was the disruption of order. The way she moved through his house as though she had already measured it for alterations. The way maids who once flinched at his shadow now spoke her name with something dangerously close to affection. But the irritation had teeth, and those teeth had begun to gnaw at something deeper. He found her one afternoon in the long gallery, standing before the portrait of his great-grandmother. Another woman who had come to Ravenshollow in chains of duty and left behind a legacy of iron. Isolde was studying the painted face with such concentration that she did not hear him approach. "You're staring at her as though she might speak," he said. Isolde did not startle. She simply turned her head. "She looks tired," she answered, "and angry, but not broken." A beat of silence. "You think that is the measure of success here?" he asked, voice low. "Not to break." "I think it is the only measure that matters," she replied. "Everything else is decoration." He stepped closer, close enough that the scent of cedar smoke and winter air clung to his coat. "You are changing my house." "I am making it breathe," she corrected. "There is a difference." His jaw tightened. "You overstep." "Then stop me." Her eyes were steady, unflinching. "You have the power. Use it." He did not answer at once. The gallery seemed to narrow around them, the painted ancestors watching like silent witnesses. "I expected you to hate this place," he said finally. "To hate me." "I did," she admitted, "for the first 3 days. Then I saw the cracks in the walls, the people holding them together with their bare hands. Hate became impractical." A muscle ticked in his cheek. You think practicality will save you here? I think practicality might save both of us. The words hung between them, plain, unadorned, dangerous in their honesty. Sebastian felt something shift inside his chest, small but unmistakable. Not warmth, not yet, but the first loosening of a knot he had carried so long he had forgotten it was there. He turned away, breaking the gaze first. "Dinner is at 8, he said, voice rougher than he intended. "Do not be late." "I will not," she answered. He walked the length of the gallery without looking back. But he felt her eyes on him the entire way. That night, at table, they spoke little. The conversation was formal, clipped, estate business, border reports, the weather turning colder. Yet every silence between their words felt heavier than before. Charged. Alive. When the last course was cleared and the servants withdrew, he rose. She rose with him. At the doorway he paused. "The still room," he said without turning. "You changed the distillation schedule." "Yes. It is better." She waited. He exhaled once, almost a laugh without humor. "I noticed." Then he left. Isolde remained in the doorway a moment longer, fingers resting lightly on the frame. The cage was still gilded. The bars were still iron. But tonight, for the first time, she had heard the faint, unmistakable sound of a key turning somewhere in the dark. Not freedom, not yet, but the possibility of it. Tension had thickened the air between them for weeks. Frustration had sharpened it to a blade. Now, in the quiet after his departure, something new flickered at the edges of the silence. Small, fragile, almost hopeful. She closed the door softly behind her and walked back toward her rooms, steps measured, heart steady. The house was still breathing easier. And so, perhaps, was she. The forged documents arrived on the first true day of winter, when frost rimed the black stone of Raven's Hollow and the wind howled like a warning. They came wrapped in plain oilskin, delivered by a courier who vanished before the steward could ask his name. Inside, 3 letters, each bearing the heavy wax seal of a different border lord, seals that had been broken and resealed with expert care. The contents were meticulous. Dates, amounts in gold, names of intermediaries, a signed confession, supposedly Isolde's own hand, detailing how she had accepted bribes to weaken the northern defenses, to pass troop movements to the king's enemies, to betray the man she had married in error and begun, against all odds, to understand. Sebastian found her in the still room, sleeves rolled, hands dusted with dried lavender as she measured out the last of the winter tonics. He did not knock. He simply stepped inside and closed the door with a sound that echoed like the fall of a portcullis. She looked up, saw the papers in his hand, saw the way his fingers held them. Not loosely, not carelessly, but as though they burned. "Read them," he said. His voice was quiet, too quiet. She wiped her hands on a cloth, took the letters and read. Each word landed like a stone dropped into still water. The forgery was masterful, her signature almost perfect, the phrasing eerily close to how she spoke when angry. Whoever had crafted this knew her, intimately. When she finished, she placed the papers on the workbench with deliberate care. "I did not write these," she said. Sebastian's gaze never left her face. "The seals are genuine. The intermediaries named are real. One of them, the merchant from Cold Harbor, was found dead this morning, throat cut. A message pinned to his coat saying he had confessed everything before he died." Isolde felt the room tilt, just once, before she steadied herself against the edge of the table. "You think I killed him too?" she asked. "I think," he said, and the words came out rough, "that I have spent the last months learning to trust you, and now I am being asked, by every lord who ever hated me, by every counselor who still believes a woman should never have been allowed inside these walls, to choose between the evidence and your word." Silence stretched between them, brittle as ice. "Then choose," she said softly. His jaw worked. "I want to believe you, but you do not. I do not know what to believe." The admission cost him. She could see it in the way the muscle at the corner of his eye twitched, in the way his hand flexed as though he wanted to crush the papers. I have built my entire life on reason, on what can be proven. And this, he gestured at the letters. This is proof, cruelly precise proof. Hurt arrived then, swift and deep, cutting past anger, past pride, straight to the place she had only recently begun to let soften. She had not expected him to fall at her feet in blind faith. She had not expected declarations of eternal trust. But she had expected, hoped, that after months of shared silences, of arguments that ended in reluctant respect, of nights when he lingered too long at the doorway of her rooms, she had expected that he would at least hesitate before assuming the worst. He did not hesitate long enough. She straightened, drew breath, felt something inside her lock into place, cold and final. Then I will not stay to be your doubt, she said. I will not stand here while you weigh my life against ink and wax and decide I am wanting. If you cannot see me, truly see me, then I will find the truth myself. Isolde. No, the word was a blade. You have your duty, I have mine. And mine does not include begging for belief. She moved past him, skirts brushing his coat, and walked out of the still room without looking back. He did not follow. That night, when the keep slept beneath a moonless sky, she packed one small satchel, her plain brown cloak, the dagger she had taken to wearing beneath her sleeve, the few coins she had saved from household economies, a folded map of the northern roads she had copied herself. No jewels, no gowns, nothing that would mark her as the Duchess of Raven's Hollow. She slipped through the servants' passages she had learned by heart, past kitchens that still smelled faintly of the bread she had helped save from waste, past the gallery where his great-grandmother's portrait watched with tired, angry eyes. At the postern gate, the night guard, a boy no older than 17, saw her face and froze. "My lady, go back to your post," she told him gently. "And when they ask, say you saw nothing." He swallowed, nodded once, stepped aside. The moors swallowed her in moments. Wind tore at her cloak, cold bit through wool and linen, but she walked on, head high, pace steady, not fleeing in shame, not running in fear, walking in resolve. Behind her, in the high chamber where he kept his maps and his silences, Sebastian stood alone. The forged letters lay spread across the table like a battlefield. He had read them again and again. Each time the words cut deeper, not because they were true. He still could not force himself to believe they were true, but because they were possible. He had let doubt in, and she had walked out the door because of it. He pressed the heels of his hands against the table until the wood groaned. Something hot and unfamiliar rose in his throat. Regret? Yes, but more than that. A fierce, aching need to prove that he had not thrown away the one thing in his life that had begun to feel like light instead of duty. He would find her. He would find the forger. He would tear the truth out of the earth itself if he had to. But first he had to forgive himself for letting her go. Outside, the wind carried the faint, distant cry of ravens. Somewhere on the moors, Isolde pulled her cloak tighter and kept walking toward the horizon. The betrayal had been sharp. The wound still bled. But what rose in its place was something hotter, brighter, more dangerous than either of them had yet named. Passionate resolve. She would clear her name. She would expose the hand that had tried to break them. And when she returned, if she returned, she would look him in the eye and see whether he had become a man worthy of the trust she had almost given. Until then, the night was hers, and the road was lawn. Steel rang against stone. Orders cut through the chaos like axes through fog. The undercroft doors exploded inward with a force that sent splinters skittering across the flagstones. Torchlight poured in behind Sebastian. 24 of his own guards, cloaks snapping, swords already drawn. He did not pause at the threshold. He strode straight to Isolde, boots grinding on broken wax seals, eyes locked on her face as though the rest of the world had gone silent. Corvin Vale took one involuntary step back. "Your Grace." "Hold." The single word stopped his men mid-charge. Sebastian's voice was quiet, but it carried the same finality it had used to silence clerks and lords alike. He looked at the table, parchment, seals, the damning draft, and his mouth twisted in something between disgust and recognition. "This ends now." Isolde felt her breath catch. Not in surprise he was here, but in the way he stood. Not as the duke who had once weighed evidence over trust, but as a man who had crossed half the duchy on horseback because a knot in his chest would not let him sleep. His cloak was travel-stained, his hair wind-tangled, and there was a fresh cut across his knuckles that might have been from breaking a door or a jaw. She did not ask. He moved until they were shoulder to shoulder. The guards, Corvin's men, hesitated, blades wavering. The spymaster found his voice again, oily and urgent. These documents prove you forged my wife's signature," Sebastian cut in. "They prove you murdered a merchant to silence him. They prove you thought me too proud to admit I was wrong." He turned his head just enough to meet Isolde's eyes. "I was wrong." The admission hung between them, raw and unguarded. No titles, no protocol, just the truth, spoken in the crypt where lies had been manufactured. She felt something inside her chest crack open. Not despair this time, but something lighter, brighter. Hope, yes, but edged with the same desperate courage that had kept her standing when the guards closed in. Now it was shared, doubled, sharpened by his presence. Corvin lunged for a hidden dagger. Sebastian's sword was out and at the man's throat before the motion finished. "You will answer to the king," he said. "Not to me. I want you alive long enough to hear every name you've betrayed." The guards dropped their weapons one by one, clattering echoes in the stone vault. Isolde exhaled, slow, steady. The air still smelled of wax and old bones, but the weight had shifted. Sebastian sheathed his blade but did not step away. When the last prisoner was bound and led out, he finally turned to her fully. Torchlight caught the hollows under his eyes. "I reread the letters on the road north," he said. "The ink bled in the rain. Your hand doesn't smudge like that. I should have seen it sooner. You saw it when it mattered." He shook his head, frustration flickering. "I let you walk out alone because I was afraid to be wrong. Afraid that trusting you meant admitting I needed you." Isolde reached out, hesitant, then certain, and closed her fingers around his wrist. The cut there was shallow, but the skin was warm, pulse steady. "I needed you too," she said. "I just didn't know how to ask." The silence that followed was not heavy. It was the kind that comes after a storm, when the wind stops howling and you realize the house is still standing. Above them, the cathedral bells began to toll, midnight, or victory, or both. The sound rolled down the stone stairs like a benediction. Sebastian lifted her hand, turned it palm up, and pressed his lips to the center as though sealing something irrevocable. "Come home," he murmured against her skin. "Not as a duchess who must be proven innocent," she replied. "As a partner who chooses to stay." He looked up then, and the torchlight caught something raw in his eyes, vulnerability he had never allowed before. "Then choose me." She did, not with a vow or a ceremony, with a single nod, fierce and sure. Together they climbed the stairs. Guards flanked them, but the path was theirs. The lies had been exposed, the forger taken, the truth spoken aloud in the place where it had almost been buried forever. Behind them, the Undercroft doors swung shut. Ahead, the night was cold, but the road back to Raven's Hollow no longer felt like exile. Hope had reignited into courage, and they would walk the rest of it side by side. The final reckoning unfolded in the great hall of Raven's Hollow itself, where once a clerk's mistake had first bound Isolde to a fate she had not chosen. Today the long oak table that had borne that fatal contract was cleared of parchment and ink. In its place stood only truth, laid out like weapons before a battle already won. The hall was packed. Border lords who had once whispered against the duke now sat stiff-backed, watching. Clergy in their heavy vestments lined the walls, candlelight flickering across their faces. Representatives of the crown, two stern-faced envoys in royal blue, occupied the high seats, their presence turning the proceeding into something official, irrevocable. Servants stood along the edges, silent witnesses to history being rewritten. Isolde entered first, alone. She wore one of her plain brown dresses, the same one she had worn the day she arrived, now carefully mended and pressed. No jewels, no coronet, only the silver band on her finger that Sebastian had placed there in private 2 nights ago, after they returned from the cathedral. The simplicity was deliberate. Let them see her as she had always been. Not an ornament, but a woman who had walked through fire and refused to burn. Sebastian followed moments later. He wore black as always, but the cloak was thrown back, revealing the sword at his hip and the absence of any ceremonial flourish. This was no pageant. This was judgment. The crown envoy rose. Let the charges be read. One by one, the forged documents were presented. The clerk who had been tricked into misplacing the pages testified, voice trembling but clear. The merchant's widow spoke of the hooded figure who had paid her husband to carry messages, then silenced him forever. A scribe from Corvinvale's own household, now under guard, read aloud the marginal notes in his master's hand, instructions to mimic Isolde's defiant tone, to make the treason seem personal, believable. Each piece landed like a hammer on stone. The hall grew quieter with every revelation, until the only sound was the crackle of the great hearth and the occasional shift of boots on marble. When the last witness stepped down, Sebastian spoke. Lord Corvinvale conspired to destroy this house from within. He sought to use my pride against me, to turn my marriage, my error, into a weapon. He underestimated 2 things. His gaze found Isolde across the hall. He underestimated her. And he underestimated what happens when a man finally learns what he is willing to lose. He crossed the floor to her. The movement parted the crowd like water. When he reached her side, he did not kneel. He simply took her hand, raised it so every eye in the hall could see their joined fingers, and turned to face the assembly. This woman, he said, voice carrying without effort, was brought here by accident. She stayed by choice. She rebuilt what neglect had weakened, listened when others commanded, and stood when others would have fled. She is no longer my wife by clerical mistake. She is my duchess by my will, my conviction, and, if she will still have me, my love. A ripple moved through the hall, shock, then something softer. A few of the older lords actually smiled. The crown envoys exchanged glances, then nodded once. The senior cleric stepped forward, holding the great register that had once recorded the false union. He opened it to a fresh page and offered the quill to Sebastian. Sebastian took it. He wrote, in clear, deliberate strokes, Lucian Sebastian Ravenshollow takes Isolde of House Valen as his wife, freely chosen, freely given, this 9th day of January in the year of our realm 426. He passed the quill to Isolde. She hesitated only long enough to meet his eyes. Then she wrote beneath his words, I, Isolde, accept him, not as duty, but as my equal, my partner, my choice. The cleric closed the book with a soft thud that seemed to echo in every corner of the hall. It is done. No trumpets, no cheers, only the slow, spreading release of held breath. The crown envoys stood. The king acknowledges this union and the clearing of all charges against the Duchess of Ravenshollow. Let the realm know justice has been served. Corvinvale and his accomplices were led away in chains. The hall began to empty, lords murmuring, clergy bowing, servants slipping out to spread the tale across the keep. Isolde and Sebastian remained before the altar that had once felt like a trap. Now it felt like a witness. He turned to her, voice low, for her ears alone. I almost lost you. You almost lost yourself, she corrected gently. But you found your way back. He exhaled, a sound that was half laugh, half surrender. I am not good at apologies. Then don't apologize. Just stay. I intend to. She felt the triumph crest, bright and hard one, then slowly ebb into something warmer, quieter. Relief. The kind that comes when the storm finally passes and you realize the roof is still above your head, the fire still burning, the person you love still standing beside you. They walked from the hall together, hand in hand. No one followed. No one needed to. Behind them, the great doors closed on the past. Ahead, the keep waited, breathing easier than it ever had before. The happiest endings, they both understood, are not the ones handed to you. They are the ones you fight for, bleed for, and finally, together, claim. Years later, the great keep of Raven's Hollow no longer felt like a fortress carved from winter stone. It had learned to breathe with the seasons. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of the east wing, windows Isolde had insisted be unshuttered even in the coldest months, catching motes of dust that danced like summer fireflies. Children's laughter ricocheted off the marble corridors that once echoed only with the measured tread of armored boots and the rustle of anxious clerks. 3 small figures tore past the long gallery. Elias, 7, leading the charge with a wooden sword raised like a banner. Mara, 5, shrieking with delight as she chased him. And little Rowan, barely 3, toddling behind on determined legs, clutching a stuffed raven that had lost most of its feathers to enthusiastic love. Isolde watched from the doorway of the solar, one hand resting on the swell of her 4th pregnancy, the other absently smoothing the edge of a letter she had been reading. The missive was from a minor border lord who had once sneered at her plain brown dresses. Now he wrote with deference, requesting her mediation in a land dispute because the Duchess's sense of fairness is known throughout the North. She smiled, small, private, the kind of smile that had become her signature over the years. Sebastian appeared behind her, silent as ever, though the years had softened the edges of his silence. His hair was threaded with silver at the temples now, and the scar along his jaw had faded to a thin silver line. He slipped an arm around her waist, careful of the curve of her belly, and rested his chin on her shoulder. They've taken the gallery again, he murmured, watching as Elias attempted to scale the portrait of his great-grandmother. I should be stern. You should, she agreed, leaning back into him. But you won't. He huffed a quiet laugh against her neck. I am ruined. Utterly. Below, the children spotted them and erupted in fresh shouts. Papa! Mama! Come see! Elias says he can fly. Sebastian sighed theatrically. The things I do for this house. He released her only long enough to stride down the stairs and scoop Rowan onto his shoulders before the boy could topple a priceless vase. Isolde followed more slowly, one hand on the banister, the other cradling the life that kicked steadily beneath her ribs. The council chamber, once a place of rigid etiquette and whispered rivalries, had become something else entirely. The long table was still there, but the chairs were mismatched now, some carved oak, some simple pine brought up from the village workshops. Decisions were made with the same gravity, but the voices were different, steadier, more varied. Women sat at the table now, not as ornaments but as stewards, healers, scholars. Border lords listened when Isolde spoke. The crown's envoys treated her words with the same weight they gave Sebastian's. Power had not been diminished. It had been shared. And in the sharing, the duchy had grown stronger than it had ever been under solitary rule. That evening, after the children were finally corralled into beds, with one last story from their father about the night a raven carried a message across a blizzard, Isolde and Sebastian stood alone on the high balcony that overlooked the moors. Snow dusted the distant hills, but the wind was gentle tonight, almost tender. He drew her against his side, wrapping his cloak around them both. They stood in silence for a long time, the way they had learned to do, comfortable in the quiet, no need to fill it. I never thought this was possible, he said at last, voice low. Not when you first walked into that chamber in your plain dress. Not when I let you leave. Not even when I found you again in that crypt. She tilted her head to look at him. You thought I would break. I thought I would. He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Instead we rebuilt each other, piece by stubborn piece. Isolde reached up, fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Fate gave us the beginning. Everything after that was us, he finished. She smiled, soft and sure. Every day, every choice. Below them the keep slept. Lamps glowed in scattered windows like stars brought to earth. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called once, low and contented, before falling silent. Fulfillment had come quietly, the way dawn arrives after the longest night. It settled into their bones, into the laughter of their children, into the way they still reached for each other in the dark. And joy, real, unpolished, resilient joy, followed in its wake. Not the fleeting kind that dazzles and fades, the kind that endures, the kind that chooses again and again to stay. They turned from the balcony together, hand in hand, and walked back into the warmth of the keep that had once been a cage and was now simply home.